Hey everyone, my name's Malia Egger and I'm Peace Corps' Third Goal Program Specialist. I'm an RPCV from Malawi, and I wanted to share some quick tips and tricks for RPCV storytelling that I've learned over my experience of storytelling training to get your stories ready for Peace Corps' first ever storytelling contest. So why do we focus so much on storytelling in Third Goal? Stories have this new, incredible sort of wave of popularity we've seen from TED Talks to The Moth. They really can humanize your country of service by letting us get to know characters from your experience. They can also teach us intercultural lessons in a funny and poignant way, and they really stick, so they really can achieve Peace Corps' third goal, so your audience will learn something about your country of service. So I'm going to take you through some ideas for finding a Peace Corps story, because it's an intimidating process to think back on your 2 years of service and sort of pick out a story to share publicly. I'm going to take you through some tricks and tips for honing and crafting your story that will make it really succinct and memorable and just sort of well thought out. And then I'm going to take you through a few tips on how to share your story. So we're going to start with finding your story. Like I mentioned, 27 months, poignant, funny, amazing Peace Corps experiences. How do you select a story to share publicly? There's a couple brainstorming activities I've given to RPCVs over the years that sort of help when you're just sort of intimidated by the overwhelming amount of information that you have to think about. So one tip is to give yourself a 2-minute free write where you sit down and you write in chronological order every person that you met in Peace Corps service. So it's kind of daunting, but if you do it chronologically and just give yourself 2 minutes, it's kind of a nice way to dig up some characters you might have forgotten. Another thing you can do, a similar list, is sort of places you went, again, chronologically, and that'll give you some interesting settings that maybe you hadn't thought of before. So if you stick to the 2 minutes, you go chronologically, things come up that are surprising. Another important part of finding your story is to think about the deeper meaning of the story. So why are you telling it? The why, sort of the deeper impact of that story beyond the entertainment value of the who, what, where, and when. Thinking about that why is important when selecting your story out of your 2 years of service. And then finally, you might want to try using certain like prods, creative story prods, like the word, think about a Peace Corps story around the word like almost, or the moment I knew I arrived. These sorts of like creative words or phrases that you can just sort of use to hone in and focus in on something like a theme. So for honing and crafting your story, I find it's really helpful to start back at something that we all sort of learned at one point in elementary or middle school, which is the story arc. But I've sort of reimagined the story arc for a Peace Corps story, for an oral Peace Corps story. And so it just sort of shows you the components of the story arc and how much time you should spend on each of them. So it starts out with the context. And you'll notice that the context is pretty brief for an oral story. And that's a challenge for RPCVs because the context is going to be your country of service. So you have to think of a way to convey your country of service in 30 seconds to a minute of spoken, which is really challenging. That's something it's important to get as succinct as you can because you want to move into the action because that's the bulk of your story. So getting from your context, which is really brief, into your action is a challenge, but it's something to work on. And once you're in the action part, that's the actual events of your story. You're getting into dialogue, you're getting into the tension. How can you build the tension? What's the challenge of your story? So spending a lot of time in the rising action and building that tension in the story arc is important. And then, your change, your shift, your climax, your conclusion, however you want to call it, you want to make sure that your build is towards that, and then you can have a little bit of falling action at the end, which is again about 30 seconds to a minute of sort of closure after that. But as you can see from the shape of the arc, you're really focusing in on that tension, so that's important. And then next, there's an activity that helps move you through the story arc by thinking through the key moments in your story, and this is called the story spine. And I find this is very helpful when you're thinking through how to get through the arc of your story. So the story spine is just this helpful tool to take you through the key moments in the story arc. And the story spine goes like this: once upon a time, and every day, until one day, because of that, and then, until finally, suddenly, and the funny thing was, ever since. So with each of these lines, you fill in a key sentence in your story, and it will just help you move through the story arc effectively and think through sort of the key bullet moments in the story.
So beyond the story arc and the story spine, there's some other tips and tricks that you can use to hone your stories and to make them really shine. So one component is framing your story. And what I mean by that is picking a first and a last line that convey the deeper meaning of the story. And it's sort of like bookends. And maybe when you say them next to each other, it would sound a little bit too planned or cheesy, but at the end and beginning of a story, people have sort of forgotten, and it's just a satisfying thing for the listener, and they don't really know why. So writing a couple of pairs of first and last lines and memorizing them is a really good way to sort of bring your story to the next level and really make the meaning of the story stick with your audience. Another important component of a good story, especially a Peace Corps story, is the senses, bringing in the senses. Everyone knows how visceral service is, so the smells, the sounds, the sights will really transport your listener to your country of service really effectively. Another important component of a story is characters, and in an oral story it's a little bit different from a written story. In a written story you can have many characters, and you can have family trees and people can refer back, but in a spoken story it's important to really only pick very few essential characters. So even if you have a whole bunch of students, picking one that sort of represents the bunch so that your listener can follow you better. Another important component of a story beyond the arc and the plot components that we discussed is insight. So letting your listeners into your brain and keeping what's called the ignorance of the moment. So it's important not to comment on things that happen later to sort of give away what's happening. Remember what you knew at that point. What did you know as a fresh, Peace Corps volunteer in your site, or whatever that point in time was. Don't sort of ruin the ignorance of the moment. Remember who you were and what you knew at that point in the story. So another important component of storytelling would be using the rule of threes. So the rule of threes is just a trick in sort of any speech writing or even in just writing. And it just says that threes are very satisfying. So if you can pick 3 examples or 3 adjectives, if you have many, which usually we do, you can just pick the 3 best and keep it to 3. And then sometimes if you can alter the third one, if you have a series and the last one's a little different. So for example, if I say, for breakfast I had toast and eggs and milk duds. If the third one's different and funny, that can sort of also be appealing to the listener and make your story just feel a little more polished. So those are some other parts of making your story shine, some other components and tricks that I've learned for storytelling. Finally, I want to share a few tips on the actual sharing or performing of your story. So most public speaking tips hold in storytelling, but one that's a little bit different, I think, especially from acting, is being authentic. In acting, you're trying to be someone else, and in storytelling, you're trying to be as much yourself as you can. You want your personality to come through. You want to get the audience on your side by being very authentic. So part of that is that you don't want to memorize your story. If you memorize a script, you can get off script and it can throw you off. You want to feel comfortable moving through your story sort of in a conversational way that allows your personality to come out. And like I said, memorizing your first and last line can really be a good way to start strong and end strong and get to that meaning. But again, just being authentic and comfortable. So you also want to practice your story, practicing with friends, practicing with family, fellow RPCVs, and we have a peer practice guide for you so that you can get the best and most helpful feedback on practicing and sort of timing your stories. And then lastly, you want to pace your delivery. If you get a laugh, just roll with it and sort of be very even-keeled in your delivery of the story and let people follow along so that you're not too fast, but things move at a pace that's comfortable for the listener. So finally, if I were just going to leave you with my 3 favorite tips using the rule of threes from the training, I would say be authentic, be as brief as possible, and then use the rule of threes. I really believe that Peace Corps stories can change the world, and it really is one of our best tools for achieving the third goal. So I hope that everybody and all our PCVs have amazing stories, will participate and submit their stories to our storytelling contest by July 1st. And at any time, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at thirdgoal@peacecorps.gov. We look forward to hearing all your stories.